Hello, everyone. Jesse Riekman. On behalf of the Vital Lands Illinois Network, I'd like to welcome you to the August 13th Vital Session titled Engaging with Tribal Nations. It looks like we have a pretty good turnout today, so I'm sure the conversation will be rich, but Todd already oriented you on how to become part of the conversation. If you aren't familiar with our Vital Sessions, there will be many opportunities for you to join the conversation, ask questions, and provide your own insight. And we do have to thank Todd for being with us today from Co-Creative Consulting to make sure that that's your everyday webinar. Some of you may remember Steve Barg and Chloris Lowe presenting compelling stories about their success in engaging tribal nations in Illinois at the most recent Vital Land Summit in Champaign this spring. There was an outpouring of positive feedback from this event, and it became clear that the conversation and should continue. So now, nearly 6 months later, we have our chance to delve deeper into this topic, and we're fortunate to have Steve and Chloris with us again to guide us in this conversation. If you missed the last summit or you aren't familiar with our hosts today, Steve Barg leads the Joe Daviess Conservation Foundation, headquartered in Elizabeth, Illinois. The foundation is a nonprofit conservation organization that has preserved 6,000 acres of conservation lands in Northwest Illinois, much of it bordering the Mississippi River. The foundation owns and operates 7 nature preserves that are open to the public for recreation research and environmental education. Chloris Lowe, member of the Sky Clan of the sovereign Ho-Chunk Nation, he negotiated on behalf of the nation with the U.S. government for recovery of 1,200 acres of traditional land for the Ho-Chunk Nation and the co-management of 6,169 acres with the state of Wisconsin. So following his last term as president of the nation, Chloris accepted a position with the National Museum of the American Indian at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. So Steve and Chloris, we've been looking forward to this opportunity for a long time, and I want to thank both of you for being here with us today. I'll turn it over to you.
All right, well, thanks Jesse and Todd for organizing this session, and Chloris, thank you for joining us. We're actually in Platteville, Wisconsin. I drove a little bit north, he drove a little bit south, and so we're coming to you from traditional Ho-Chunk territory, not too far from the Mississippi in southwest Wisconsin. That Ho-Chunk territory, as it's been explained to me by Chloris, extends traditionally, historically, all the way down into northwest Illinois. Basically the Rock River, everything north and west of the Rock River was part of the Ho-Chunk Nation. That's both your oral history and in treaties, is that right?
Yeah, the very first treaty established at least by federally government recognized that the nation had a specific geographic area, and Steve basically encompassed that. It encompassed 10.5 million acres at its inception in 1825. By 1837, it was virtually gone.
Wow, 12 years. All right, we're gonna jump right into engaging, and we're gonna talk about why land trusts might engage with tribal groups. And we're gonna start off by talking about traditional ecologic knowledge. And I'm gonna actually ask my daughter, Hannah Barg, who's joined us from North Carolina. Hannah did some research for her senior thesis at Goshen College on traditional ecologic knowledge. And you can see the slide up here, kind of talked about the basic of this is that we both, land trusts and tribal groups, have a shared common interest in land stewardship. But we've approached, though, that understanding of how we manage and care for lands from very different perspectives. So Hannah, can you just shed a little bit of light on traditional ecologic knowledge for the group?
Sure. Hi, I'm Hannah. And I did my senior thesis research with Dave Ostergren at Goshen College, focused on how specifically the National Park Service is integrating TEK into their workplace and how they're doing that. What are the barriers? What are the challenges to that? So I wanted to start by giving a definition of traditional ecological knowledge. So it's sort of broadly defined as this deep intergenerational knowledge of a specific place that people hold. And so that's very broad, and some people would consider people groups such as the Appalachian people and other people who aren't necessarily indigenous people to hold traditional knowledge. But in the academic world, it's sort of understood that TEK is referring to indigenous people, endemic people to a place, and the knowledge that they have accumulated from being intimately tied to that place. And so there's a lot of debate in the academic community and elsewhere about TEK, mostly because it's really a term that the scientific community uses to talk about indigenous knowledge. And so obviously that has some limitations. And I would say the biggest critique of TEK is that it limits the cultural, spiritual, political worldview components of an indigenous person's understanding of the land. So this goes directly into land management, particularly even the word management might be a limiting factor for indigenous people trying to co-manage, because management implies that humans own the land, whereas Winona LaDuke would say that the land owns people. And so using the term traditional ecological knowledge is a gateway into how we understand and talk about co-managing, but it really is limited in its ability to fully describe what co-management might look like.
Thank you, Hannah. So one of the areas where we would engage with tribal communities would be around understanding the land and managing the land for health. I think the bottom line here is to understand that there's different ways of knowing, that our perspective often comes from the scientific way of knowing the land. And many indigenous cultures look at the land way more integrated with spiritual, cultural, scientific, political knowledge. And I think one of the basic differences is, Hannah pointed out, is we see ourselves as owning the land and therefore managing the land. And many traditional indigenous cultures look at the land as that their people came out of the land, and it's really the land teaching us how to care for the land. Different perspectives, but still can be thought of as, how do we, if we get together, how much more enriching our stewardship or care for the land could be. So we're going to move on to that. We could spend hours on this topic, but I just wanted to introduce that up front as one of the biggest whys we might want to engage with tribal groups. For us, the land preservation program interest, we have a lot of lands that have Native American heritages on them, and I use the word plural there because not all Native American heritage is the same. It's different for different tribes, and we have multiple tribes in our area of Northwest Illinois, and that's likely the case for most places in Illinois. You will find multiple tribal heritages on that land. And then our board staff and our members and volunteers have let us know that they're interested in working with tribal people to understand the land that we own and care for in more complex, more sophisticated ways. I'm going to turn this over to Chloris. We did not rehearse this PowerPoint, but we did talk, and Chloris shared some of these things as why tribal nations might want to engage with land trusts. But you want to talk a little bit more about this, Chloris?
Sure. I guess I'd like to just back up just a bit, because we understand the lack of time that we have together here today. So we're going to attempt to keep our end of it as short as possible. And so that we can get to the more of the Q&A, which is important to you, because there is your interest is not something that we can gauge at this point, other than the fact that you've all gathered here today at this point with this technology. But what's important is that we hear the questions that you have, and then we can attempt to address those, I think, Steve. I think that it's really important to understand one element. There's many elements, but the one primary element is to understand that the land that you care for in one form or another is land that's looked upon by traditional Native American people. We feel that we are a part of that land. We take a look at all the land as being sacred. We understand that there are literally hundreds of millions of human souls that have come before us, that have been here in this country that we call the United States. And that's just the United States. There's over 5,500 cultures in this hemisphere that exist yet today, Aboriginal cultures. And understand that all these hundreds of millions of people that preceded us, these are our ancestors in this landscape. They make up that which is the land, and that which you work with on a daily basis is what's really important to us, because we see this no less than the landscape as being one large, huge cemetery, if I can put it that way. So that's what the sacredness in the land is. And we have a belief system that is based in this, is that there is a continuum of life. The life and the spirit that we have as individuals continues on once this vessel that we call our bodies dies and passes on into the earth. And part of that life and part of that spirit then goes with that body and becomes a part of the earth, and everything that grows on this earth comes from the earth, obviously, everything that we have. And it's important to understand that from a traditional perspective. And I emphasize traditional. I'm not saying that all Native Americans, all Indians, American Indians, all understand or believe this. But I can tell you that traditional Native American people who have the belief system that goes back untold thousands of years, that belief and understanding is that these spirits and this life resides on this land, and everything that comes from the land becomes a part of that life and that spirit. And we are nothing but caretakers today. And when I say that, that includes you. And that's why it's so important, I think, that there's a shared interest in land stewardship, but perhaps not a total understanding as to why that is. From a Native American perspective, being very selfish, to be able to work with Steve and JDCF and people like yourselves, traditional Native American people, understand that we are drawing people in and having hopefully a better understanding of what this landscape really is, that it's much more than what we look at today when we pick up soil in our hands, that in all likelihood that it goes well beyond that. And so what you're doing as caretakers is something that we live as caretakers, and that this land and this landscape is something, that's where the sacredness comes from. It's not just the burial grounds that are so evident, and the burial mounds and effigy mounds, those types of things, but it extends across this entire landscape. And it is something that it becomes holy ground. It becomes sacred ground. And you can call it heritage lands, and you can call it whatever you want to call it. But from a Native American perspective, the fact that you are caretakers and helping us caretake for this land, something that we pass on to future generations, and hopefully a better understanding of what this land really is. I'll stop there.
Okay, thanks, Chloris. So the National Park Service has been working in this space longer than any other land-based group in the United States, although Hannah pointed out to me that Canada has been doing this government to government, Canadian government to tribal governments, co-managing of lands for a lot longer than that. One example of where this is headed is just north of where Chloris and I are sitting right now, Effigy Mounds National Monument, one of the largest protected group of mounds in the United States. Beautiful sacred area right along the Mississippi River bluffs. Jim Nepstead, who's their superintendent, has taken this charge very seriously and hired a tribal historian, Albert Lowe, to come onto his staff to help their staff understand more of this traditional indigenous knowledge that Chloris is talking about, and how that's integrated into the caretaking of that space, Effigy Mounds National Monument. So we're moving in that direction nationally, slowly, but that's a good indicator that there's a lot to be gained by bringing these different ways of knowing about the land together for stewardship. So how to engage with tribal nations. This is the most difficult thing for that we all come up against. In the survey work that Hannah did at Goshen, one of the biggest barriers, or Hannah, was this the biggest barrier, was actually finding out who to connect with?
Yeah, so the initial prediction was that the biggest barriers were cultural and religious and like spiritual understandings that were different. But through the survey analysis, we actually found that the biggest barrier to National Park Service employees being able to successfully implement TEK in their work was not being connected to the tribal nations in their area.
Okay, great. So this is our biggest barrier. So first of all, how to engage. First, you need to have a specific reason. Understand that these nations are busy people, they're governments, and if you're just going to call up to, say, hey, I have this really cool piece of land, I'd like you to come see it. That's just not going to happen. So really look back at the whys and understand why they might want to engage. You own land that might be sacred to them, whether it has mounds or not, is one thing that they might be thinking about, but also why are you thinking about this? So you really have to dig into the whys first. Second, know the difference between pseudo groups, alliances, versus nations. Chloris, you want to talk a little bit about what the difference between nations, tribal nations, and then alliances or other groups that might call themselves Native American?
I think it's really important from a context standpoint to define the nations that are involved, or the tribes, nations, tribal governments, they're all one and the same. Understand that if you have success with one, doesn't mean you're going to have success with everyone, because there are currently here just in the United States, there's 568 federally recognized tribes. Each one of those is a separate tribal government, has their own treaties, has their own agreements with the federal government. There are certain relationships that are the same, many that are parallel. But understand that if you're going to engage with a tribe, it has to be that tribal government. And the initial engagement, once you've made that decision to proceed, should go to that tribal leader. That letter, that introduction, that string of relationships, if you're lucky enough to be able to have a personal relationship that can connect to that tribal governmental leader, that's going to be really important. And all of these leaders they have many different specific official titles. They could be a chairman, they could be a president, and it goes on and on and on, depending on the part of the country. I'm guessing that most of the nations that you would engage with are going to be, more than likely, are going to be chairmen or chairpersons of their respective nations. So your initial contact, once you've identified the tribe, is to identify who is the leader of that nation. Do not Google it up and assume that information that's on the website is current, because many times it's not. A call to the nation would be important to make to verify who the tribal leader is. And then you proceed from that point, and then you go down to the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, identify who that is, because you want to copy them on this, because anything that you're going to be doing is more than likely going to go through that Tribal Historic Preservation Officer. That's the first step.
So, and even so we're in like second generation, well, third generation since you and I started working, Chloris, of tribal leaders at the Ho-Chunk, for example. So, I'm in the third elected official, different elected official of the leader of the Ho-Chunk, and Chloris has been helping to introduce our work to this new leader. Even the last leader knew who we were. Same with the director of cultural heritage for the Ho-Chunk. He's gone. He's the boss of the TIPO. And Chloris is now introducing me to the new historic, the heritage executive director, who the TIPO or the Ho-Chunk works for. So the governments change regularly, and that's one of the things Chloris is talking about. A formal letter, a formal introduction is appropriate when you're in the presence of that person. I always forget this, but I should be referring to Chloris as President Lowe. Just like you would, if you met President Carter or President Clinton, you would call them president, even though they aren't currently the president. That's still how you refer to them. So Chloris, as a past president, official welcomes, I often, not always, I sometimes forget still, Chloris, to introduce him as President Lowe. So respect for the position is, I think, very important. The TIPO is who you'll be working with, most likely, the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer. And this can take years of work to get to finally connecting with the TIPO. And then one of the best things is just when you find the tribe that's from your area, or tribes, go visit them. Go to their sessions, their programs, their camps, their reservations, their heritage centers, and learn about who you're working with. I think that's really, really important. Read up. There's lots of great resources. What is it that you might do together? We're going to kind of end with this slide, and this talks about what JDCF is doing with Chloris and the Ho-Chunk and doing with other tribal leaders as well. And we'll talk about a few of those. But we're a little over 10 years into this relationship. We started with Chloris. We've been introduced to John Greendeer, who is the also a past president and executive director of cultural heritage for the Ho-Chunk. Came down and visited with us a couple of years ago. He was a speaker at our annual meeting. Chloris has led many tours, seminars, helped out with our children's camp, done lectures. We had Kay Rhodes in from the Sac and Fox, the current chief, or the past chief. At the time, she was chief of the Sac and Fox. Inviting tribal leaders to come to your area if they're interested, or you going to their area, are things you should be thinking about. We've changed our burial mound management practices because of interaction with tribal TIPOs and heritage professionals. So we've changed where our trails go. We stopped mowing mounds. Trying to think what else we've done. Those are the two main things we've done. And most recently, we invited 22 tribes who can trace their heritage to Northwest Illinois to participate in a visioning of a tribal heritage interpretive center, discovery center at our Wapello Preserve. We got responses from 5 tribal groups. We were absolutely thrilled with that. Chloris is serving as our tribal consultant. And what we envision is building a center where non-Indian people can go and learn about Indian culture that can trace their heritage to this region as interpreted by them, not interpreted by some PhD white person, but literally interpreted by their PhDs or their historians. We hope that we will provide a place where tribes can tell their stories and not only tell their stories of past, but what are they doing now? Where has their culture been moved forcibly? Why this land might still be important, and what they see the future of their tribe in this region being. So we're one meeting in. It was a Zoom meeting like this with 5 TIPOs, more or less. What else can you share about that process, Chloris? It's been kind of interesting.
I guess it's an understanding that all of these tribes that you may be engaging with or may not have the most historical reference to one another. Just understand that. I mean, it's very, very possible. Because the land itself is something that, even though the tribes did not look at land as something you owned, but something that you were caretakers of, it still was an area that you worked off from, that you provided for your people, for your village, for your clans, for your families. And some of these areas would be disputed. So it would really be important to understand the relationship. If you have multiple tribes that have been identified that you may be working with on a project or a number of projects, understand that some of that may not have been the most harmonious in the past, regardless of what you see on Walt Disney and you know, the movies. It wasn't always something where people got along, because a great example of the ricing beds that used to exist on the Mississippi River. There were many battles fought over those ricing bed areas. And also all the other areas in which there were, if people felt that they were being encroached upon, it wasn't unusual for tribes to go and have battles over those particular lands, because that's what they subsisted on. That's what they lived on. And it was also something they understood, respective nations, hey, you know, we have people here that are buried on these lands. And if you think you're coming into this, it's not going to be easy if you don't do this the right way. And so understand that when you're out there working with that situation. How do you know that? I'm going to probably open myself up to something here that I won't regret it, but I'll wonder why I did it probably at some point, which is this, that all of you that are participating here today, I would like to be able to have my contact information, if you don't already have that, distributed to you, so that when you sit down and you look at this and you go, where do I start? How do I start? What we're doing is we're just opening this up today. And I'd be willing to try is the key word, to try to answer the questions you may have at some point in the future when this session is done.
Thank you, Chloris. So with that, here's, I didn't give out your phone number, Chloris, but I did give out your email address. And you can, you know, email Chloris and start the conversation there. But we wanted at this point to open it up to questions. And I completely forgot, Todd, that we were going to do polling questions to start off. So do we want to do any of those polling questions?
It's up to you, really.
So let's start with the first two questions, and then we'll see where this goes. But I think those questions are important.
Okay, we're going to start with one. I'm going to launch this now. And the question simply, are you currently considering working with tribal nations or groups on land conservation projects? And if you're not online and you're just on the phone, people are voting. That's why there's a lull. We've got about 20 votes in, and just give you another few seconds to get your result in, and we'll show the results. Looks like
about half.
Yeah.
Okay.
Wonderful.
Why don't you go to the next question, and then after that, we'll open it up to questions.
Okay, second question, have you ever made contact with a tribal member or alliance?
Better answer that.
Third question.
And just seconds, yes, no. All right. And interesting.
Okay. Got a little over half, right around half. And there's a third question in that grouping.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
It's a little different. Have you ever made contact with a tribal nation's elected official or staff member of a tribe? All right.
Oh, about half. Good.
Yeah.
Well, that seems to be a higher percentage than when we talked about this in February at the summit. But I know we have other people on who weren't at the summit too. So, all right, I think at this point we can just open it up to questions that or that were emailed to you, Todd, or anything like that.
Yeah, so I don't know if you're seeing this, Steve and Chloris, but in the chat, you can see that there are a few questions already in there. And do you see how to get to the chat? So they're down at the bottom, you'll see chat.
Yeah, okay, got it.
Yeah. And feel free, folks, to open up your mic and ask a question verbally and in the chat. So as we get going, you know, feel free to use the chat, but also open up your mic. And
okay, so I'll answer what just the first question we see. Jerry Paul said, you need to communicate with the head of the cultural office or just the TIPO. What about removing trees from burial mounds? We have used, we have adopted the Lower Wisconsin Riverway. I think that's close to what it is. Their mound policy, mound protocol, because it had a lot of input from the Ho-Chunk and other tribal groups that we would consider in our region. And they have a policy about trees within there. And so, and there's differing opinions on this, even within tribal nations, but the way we go about is we remove small trees from burial mounds, leave the bigger trees until they look like they're failing. We don't want to cut down a mature tree, and try and cut it down before it gets to the point where it might fall over and disturb the mound. That's the biggest issue with trees on mounds, is they have the potential to uproot and disturb the things in the mound. It's a natural process, but eventually we want to have most trees off mounds, but that's going to take decades. Anything you want to add to that?
When you go to remove the trees, it's important that that be done during the winter time when the ground's frozen, because there's a real good high probability that you're going to disturb the earth if you do it when the ground is not frozen. And it's really important that if you have a mound area that is not, it does not have trees on it, it would be really important to try to keep all of the woody plant material off that mound area so that you don't have to deal with this problem in the future.
Steve, can you share through Vital Lands that mound management protocol you mentioned?
Yeah, it's the Lower Wisconsin State Riverway. If you just Google mound, Lower Wisconsin Riverway, and put in mound policy or mound protocol, you should be able to find it. I don't have it right in front of me, but yeah. And then your question, Jerry, about the TIPO or the cultural officer, most of the time that's the same person, but in some tribes, larger tribes, more complex tribes, the TIPO reports to a cultural executive director. So just, I would start with the TIPO and ask, you know, do I need to consult your boss, or are you authorized to help us with this decision? Let's see.
If I might add, Steve, on that mound protocol,
Yeah.
it is considered to be literally one of the best mound protocol from a nation, from the Native American nations perspective that exists out there. It's something that was actually started by Ho-Chunk. I actually did have some involvement with that many years ago when we started working with the Lower Wisconsin Riverway Commission. And ultimately then that was accepted by the state of Wisconsin, and obviously was promoted heavily by the tribes. So it is something that it's a very, very good document to work off from.
Okay, so from Barbara, it says the Shawnee tribe group that was recognized by the U.S. Forest Service lives in Oklahoma. Shawnee tribe members who live in the vicinity of Shawnee National Forest are in conflict with the Oklahoma tribe. We had a contact with the local tribe, the Vineyard Group. What do we do?
Okay, let me answer that one.
Yeah.
Because I'm not familiar with this, is the Vineyard Group, I don't believe they are a recognized federal tribe at this point. What you're talking about, if you're going to engage with the tribe, it's with the tribal government and not with tribal people of that particular tribe. If you get caught in the middle of that, then you have problems. And I can see that looks like maybe what's happening here, where you have members of a tribe that may be in disagreement with their tribal government.
Yeah.
If that's the way I'm reading it, that's what I see there. And though you've already engaged with them, I think it's really important to understand that any engagement you have officially should be initially with that tribal government, even though you've engaged with this group of people. It's no different than it's take any other form of government, and if you have a group out there that is not in agreement with the tribal government or the state government or the county government or the federal government, if you have a group of people within that institution or that government that is disagreeing with the tribe, if you can just take a step back, take a close look at who you're engaging with and why. It goes back to one of the whys that Steve was talking about earlier. You need to deal with the tribal government and not with a separate group of people. Not with an alliance, not with somebody who may be well-meaning. But if you're going to engage, it needs to be with the official tribal government.
Okay. Yeah. Next question, I'm going down to Joyce. Our effort to contact the tribal nation related to local efforts for land and water conservation fund property we're trying to protect from development. We did emails, letters, and phone calls, and finally did talk to the president. Never any interest in the efforts to protect the property, which was documented to be a historic Peoria Nation campground. I'm signed off on the proposal. And so they have really, well, what should we have done?
I think that what you've done is what you can do at this point for that particular project. Tribe fails to, if you've gone through everything that you've said here, and I do not doubt that you have, it's very possible, like Steve said earlier, most tribes do not have the capacity nor the capability to move forward with special projects. They are doing everything they can to just maintain where they are at, unfortunately. And I'll say it here, and I'll probably pay the price for this at some point, but in this nation, there are haves and have-nots in Indian country. And of the 568 tribes here in the United States, most of them are have-nots. Most of us are either are today or have been subsistence nations. Nations that have existed wholly, totally on federal grants, state programs, individuals, institutions that may have looked at them and said, well, these people need some help. And this is what we have survived on. I can say that because in 1980 and 81, our tribe, the Ho-Chunk Nation, had a 78% rate of unemployment. We had zero income. We owed the federal government, excuse me, over $300,000. We had no money. We didn't have a penny of our own money. We didn't employ a person. We were a subsistence nation. Most tribes today, unfortunately, of the 568, fall into that category. There are tribes today, 35, 40 years later, that are no longer that. We are one of the fortunate tribes. So when you have reached out and you've tried to work with this group of people, it may be not because they have an interest. They may not, in all likelihood, have the capability. And therefore have just let this fall aside.
Thank you. Okay.
One other question came in. What are some of the best resources to start with to identify which tribal nations are in a given region? I don't know exactly how to answer that. Do you, Chloris?
Well, actually, there's not several. There's some places that I can think of because I've had this question posed to me about tribal individuals. You know, what tribe possibly were these people from, or where did they come from? And so when you take a look, because I don't know what part of the state you're in, but you could just take any state here in the United States, and then at least in the continental United States. And a good starting point would actually be the Department of Interior with the Bureau of Indian Affairs in Washington, D.C. This is not going to be an immediate answer, but at least you can pose the question to them. You will get a response, but it may take some real time out there. They are historically slow. So that'd be one point. The other is that with the technology that we have today, you can actually Google up federally recognized tribes and ask for, Google up for a map. And you will see where the tribes are today. There's actually some pretty good maps out there. So that would be one place. Well, when you're looking at a specific area for your particular institution, that's something that it will just, I wouldn't start with Interior. I'd start by Googling it. Then I would at least send a note off to the Interior, to the Department of the Bureau, or to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the BIA, and pose the question to them, and certainly give them your geographic area and see what they can do for you historically. Because it's one thing to work with people that may be on the landscape today. It's another to understand how many peoples have crossed that landscape and what did they do on that landscape and how were they there. The tribal people were very mobile, extremely mobile. And in understanding that, I think that Steve was probably a little taken back when you first looked at your project, Steve. The latest project that you're looking at, and understood that there's a possibility, hey, we need to contact at least 20 tribes out there. Mm-hmm. And of the 20, I forget who it was that asked earlier about, well, we contacted these people and they didn't respond. Of the 20 that were contacted, we had 5 responses. which was amazing. We thought we would get like 3 or 4. Again, because the tribes just do not have the capability and the capacity to respond. And I know you shake your head and say, well, they could have given us a phone call or an email back. The answer to that is probably no. They probably didn't have the resources. There are some of these tribes that have 0 staff. There are some of these tribes that meet maybe once a month in a tribal council meeting, maybe once a month. And so maybe that's what you're running into in all likelihood.
So it looks like Hannah and Brooke have posted some links here that could be helpful as well. National Park Service being one, and native land, not sure exactly, but anyways, you can click on those links that are posted on the Zoom chat. Thank you for doing that.
Yes, thank you.
Let's see, other questions. Todd, we had some emailed questions, is that right?
Yeah, I put those into the chat now. There's a couple there.
Can you just ask them? Because I'm not seeing them right now, but.
Yeah, they should be there.
Is the tribe? I think that's where he's at here.
They're from me.
Oh, if the tribe is interested in owning property.
Right.
Yeah. So what is the correct process to go through to work out a sale?
Let me ask you this. Would you buy your grandparents' graves, their cemetery, if somebody else owned the property?
Yes, of course.
I think that answers that question. You're asking what I had said earlier in the process of this particular meeting that we're having is that everything has a life, and everything has a spirit, and it's sacred. You're talking about sacred ground here being sold, bought and sold. And my response to that is that doesn't happen. I think the transfer of land is something that you take a look and take your feet out of your shoes and put them into the moccasins. Say that. Look at it from that perspective. You're asking us, whomever this nation may be, you're asking these people to buy back their dead. It just isn't right.
Interesting. All right, so so where could we go with that, Chloris? Let's explore that a little bit further. Unless there's other questions we haven't gotten to, Todd. I don't want to. But one of the things, what are some of the best resources?
We've seen this.
Okay, let's just let's end this because this is where I think we JDCF may be going, and that is if we what would it look like to repatriate burial mound sites to a tribal nation? So JDCF owns land that is, we own a lot of different lands that have burial mounds on them. What kind of process? So there's no state recognized tribal groups in Illinois. There's no nationally recognized tribal groups that live in Illinois. There are individuals of nationally recognized tribal groups. So it's sort of like what could we do in that circumstance?
Well, I think that it goes to JDCF and at least Ho-Chunk Nation at this point, on a very preliminary basis, looked at the possibility of taking some of these lands that are certainly identified with sacred burial sites, and in one form or another, moving them to the care of the nation, or perhaps the joint care of the nation and JDCF.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just being explored at this point. Certainly isn't any sale involved here. It is talking about an understanding that JDCF has certainly demonstrated their understanding of the sacredness of these lands. And because of that, and because of it being reiterated again and again over the years, the nation is looking at how do we work with JDCF, just like we're looking here today, how do all of our participants in this webinar, how do we engage with tribes and tribal nations and why? And the tribe is doing the same. How do we do this? How do we engage with an organization that is meeting and exceeding any expectations we would have ever had of any organization work outside of the tribe to meet what we see as a need for caretaking of lands? How do we do this together? And that's where we're engaged in it right now. And the tribe does want to do this. It's the question of how do you do that and how wide-ranging, how far-ranging is this? The how it happens is still being worked out. I wish that we had an answer here today. If it was up to Steve and I, it'd be done. Okay? Oh, we'd want to do it. But we try to have both sides of people that work with JDCF and people that I know are tribal. Because we could see this transfer happening. This is where it should all go.
Okay, I think we're coming to a close here. To stay to 1 hour. Todd, is there anything else we want to do? I did have some more slides. If anybody wants to stay on, we could do that. Perhaps there's a few more questions. Chloris and I can stick around, but I want to be respectful to the people who allotted an hour for this and kind of wrap things up. I'm proposing as a next step to do another session at the Vital Land Summit and maybe bring in some other tribal voices. And I know Chloris would be open to that. So if you've got tribal groups you're working with, please let me or Jesse or Todd know, and we'll try and maybe have being a little presumptive here, but maybe have another follow-ons and groups that are doing with Todd.
Absolutely, something that Steve. I think that's exactly what we should do. I put my email address in the chat to everyone. Please send any contacts or ideas my way, or Todd's way, or Steve and Chloris, and we will work together to try to take this even further.
Great. One other thing, if you send an email to me, because of all the stuff that's floating around out there in the world today, if you would just put in Vital Lands Summit or Vital Lands, something to identify that I know where that's coming from, because otherwise I don't respond to it.
Great.
And then I just put a link to a short evaluation. So please take the time to just give us a quick evaluation, and you can give comments and suggestions for future explorations as well there.
Great.
So Steve and President Lowe, I just want to make sure that I thank you guys again for your time today, and I really appreciate your offer to stick around for questions afterwards, but just because our hour is up, I just want to thank you again for the larger group for doing this for us.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you.
So if there's any other questions for people who are sticking around, fire away, unmute and ask us your question.
I have a follow-up about the sale of land. I'm aware of a mound group along the Rock River that's in private ownership, and the owners want to sell it. It's not under threat of development, but we're not in a position to acquire it. So is there any process that go through to see if the nation is interested in that property?
Certainly. I would, I think that I've been involved in conversations with property owners in situations very similar to this in the past. And then after several conversations, the land ends up being protected. And it's done in such a way that that particular parcel of land is not only protected, but it's something that does, the nation also then takes care of. But it's never been purchased. So if you have that, I can pass that information along. I am guessing the nation that it's probably Ho-Chunk, if it's along the Rock River, that falls certainly within our traditional land base. And it's important for anybody that's still on land, if you're online, that if you're dealing specifically with that boundary that Steve laid out earlier, which is everything west of the Rock River, all the way down to the confluence of the Rock and Mississippi, and then northward up the Mississippi, and because you're in Illinois, would be to the Illinois state line. But if there's somebody else that's in here that's, say, from Wisconsin, Iowa, Minnesota, it extends all the way up to the Chippewa River, the confluence of the Chippewa up there. Then a day's march north, which by definition in 1825 was a man on a horse, which takes you up to Highway 29, the area Highway 29, which runs basically east-west from Green Bay over to the Twin Cities, and then back down the Fox River Valley to the beginning of the Rock River. So it's a huge area. If that land, if what you're talking about falls within that land base as defined in the Treaty of 1825, that's extremely important because the federal government recognizes the Ho-Chunk Nation today. That's our traditional land base, is defined by the federal government. And all the land ultimately was ceded away, the tribe has rights within that traditional land base defined in the Treaty of 1825 out of Prairie du Chien. And so if this land that you're talking about, boy, this is getting long-winded. If this land that you're talking about with on the Rock River, if it's on the west bank of the Rock River, that's something that Ho-Chunk would be probably knowledgeable of, and if they're not, they would like to be. So if that's the case, let me know.
Well, we've been working with Bill Quackenbush on this piece.
He's married into my family. Go ahead. I'm sorry, I had to interject that. Bill's a great guy.
So we've been working with him. They've actually he's commissioned some survey work on it, but just want to be clear what the next steps might be. So thanks a lot.
Phil Milhouse, the archaeologist on that, perhaps?
Yeah, Phil did the work.
Yeah, Phil's a great guy.
Oh, yeah.
He's a great guy. Good. Well, you're working with the right guy, Bill. Bill Quackenbush is the right guy to work with. There's no question of that. Are you looking for some help with Bill?
No, he's pretty responsive.
Excellent. Okay.
I don't know if he might need some help on the, pushing it up the ladder. I don't know about that.
And I've offered that to him with other things that we've done. And that could be done. Why don't I just give Bill a call when we get done here today? I'll drop him a note and then I'll give him a call, because Bill only works about 20 minutes from my home.
Okay.
Well, I'll do that.
Great, thanks.
You're welcome, Jerry.
Any other questions before we leave? I see we still have a few people on the line.
We just got one, Steve, not to interrupt, about what does it mean to be federally recognized?
So there are state recognized tribes here in the United States. They do not carry the legal cloak, if I can put it that way, that a federally recognized tribe does. A federally recognized tribe has agreements, treaties, usually multiple, with the federal government. And a federally recognized tribe is recognized under the Constitution of the United States. It's a powerful legal mantle to be a federally recognized tribe. You're recognized as a sovereign nation. It's somewhat limited, but not much. A federally recognized tribe has a recognized leader, one person who acts on behalf of that nation or that tribe with the federal government. That person's signature is needed. Any interaction with the federal government involves that person or their designees. It is the heart and soul of tribal nations to be a federally recognized tribe.
One of the groups we're working, one of the 5 groups we're working with on the Discovery Center envisioning is the Ponca tribe. And they have, they were federally recognized, then they were terminated from the federal recognized roles, and then recently came back onto the federally recognized roles. And that process was very detrimental to the tribe in terms of keeping its culture, heritage, community, traditions, economies going. And so that's probably one of the least resource tribes we're working with in this group, is the Ponca. So it means a great deal, as Chloris said, to have that federal recognition as a tribe. There's been other in and out. Pardon?
There are also a number of non-recognized tribes.
We're not able to hear you very well, Hannah. You're breaking up.
Maybe turn your video off, might free up some bandwidth, Hannah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay. I just wanted to clarify that there's also a number of unrecognized tribes that don't fall under state or federal recognition as well,
Yes.
correct?
Yes, that's right. Quite a few in the West Coast, I understand. And the East Coast. Yep.
And would I be correct in assuming then that those all have governmental organizations that would be contacted in the same way? I mean, whether they're federally recognized or not, they would still be, we would still work with them in a similar way, right?
I would think so, but I think they may not have the governmental structure. I don't know how to answer that, Chloris.
Okay, if you want to reach out and hold hands with somebody, that's good. But if you want something that's going to stand in a court of law for whatever reason, it's not going to stand.
Okay.
It needs to be a federally recognized tribe. It is important that a federally recognized tribe, I'll use my own tribe as an example rather than somebody else's, and that way my tribal people can come after me if they want. The Ho-Chunk Nation has a constitution that's been recognized by the federal government. We have, under that constitution, a legislative body, used to be the tribal council. We have an executive arm of government that's led by now the president, and it used to be the chairman. And we have courts, plural, within the tribe. We have a traditional court, which handles literally traditional questions that come before the courts. And sometimes within our, we have three different levels of court systems. We have the traditional court, we have the Supreme Court, and then we have the lower court systems. It's so important that we're a federally recognized tribe because we have entered into agreements in the state of Wisconsin where the decisions that are rendered by our judges within the courts are decisions that are recognized by the state of Wisconsin. We, in turn, recognize decisions that have been arrived at by the state of Wisconsin. I can say that with some clarity because my sister happens to be the chief judge of the trial court, and there are 5 judges in that trial court system. And then we have a Supreme Court. Then we have a general council, which is a meeting of the membership of the nation, of which we have over 7,000 people in our tribe right now. And it's not unusual for us to put in the same room somewhere between 1,700 and 2,000 people when we meet as a general council. And in that general council, for that day, during the time that it's in session, that general council is in charge of the government. Decisions can be made that are, if they're in alignment with the Constitution, can be made under that Constitution. And it's recognized as law. And that's why it's important that if you're dealing with a non-federally recognized tribe or a state recognized tribe, that it's really important that you understand what you are doing. But the reality of it is, if you get into a court for whatever reason, they do not carry the weight that the federally recognized tribes do. I think it's important to share this. There's a little point in history here. Before the United States was the United States, it consisted of the colonies. And the colonies, before they went to war with Great Britain, understood that they had the potential for a greater enemy on their western borders. And that potential enemy was literally on their borders, and it was all these tribal nations. And they had no idea how deep and how many. But they entered into, our fathers of our country entered into an agreement with these tribes before they, this is a little known historic fact, before they went to war with Great Britain. And what came of that was after the war with Great Britain, these treaties that had been entered into with these native nations were the very first ratified by the new Congress of what was to become the United States. And that is so important to understand that at the beginning of this country that we now call the United States, the people who started this understood that they were dealing with these tribal nations as sovereign entities. And the courts today look at that in much the same way. There's a reason why when you go into the Capitol and into the Dome in Washington, D.C., and you look up, I don't know how many of you have been there, I assume many of you, and remember what you looked at on all of those panels that are in the Capitol Dome. Most of them have Indians in them. There is a reason for that, because they were there before the inception of this country, and they were recognized as sovereign nations before this nation was truly a nation. And then those agreements were ratified by the first Congress. Some of the very first agreements that were ever ratified with any other countries in the world as we know it today. And that's why the federally recognized tribe has this kind of standing legally. Anytime that you see a state take a tribe to court and it gets to the United States Supreme Court, you can just about know what's going to happen, because the states were not there before the tribes. The tribes were there first in that legal room, that legal environment. It's really interesting history when you take a look at it. The Indians are out there on these paintings for color, for looks. Oh, they look pretty good, they're colorful, but there's a reason they're there in the Capitol Dome at the beginning of this country and through time. That's one of the greatest things. I get chills when I walk into that dome and I look around there and go, we were here then. So sorry to get carried away. I'll get off that soapbox.
All right, I think we're gonna, if there's no more questions, that's a good statement to end on, I think, a button. All right,
thank you all.
Yep. Thanks, Todd. Thanks, Jesse.
Yeah, one more reminder for the evaluation. It's a link in the chat, and you can just give us some ideas. Thank you.
All right, thanks.
Bye-bye. Thanks, everyone.